incredibly important conversation around the rural economy and particularly the role of the rural economy in levelling up. I'm Kate Rock. I'm on the advisory board of Onward, who did a very fantastic report about levelling up in the rural economy. And I'm delighted to be joined by a very esteemed panel today. We have obviously Secretary of State George Eustice, who has been, I think, one of the longest standing Secretaries of State in DEFRA for a while now. So I'm delighted to have George, and joined by Caroline Johnson and by Robbie Moore MPs, both who have very strong interest in the wider rural economy. And thank you to the NFU and to Minette for joining us. I think we're going to have quite a lot to talk about. There's so much around the rural economy, from connectivity to planning to agriculture. So I want to open it up, if I may, to the audience as quickly as possible. But first I thought we could just get each of our panellists to just give a 5-minute overview, and then we can go into questions. So George, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kate. And real pleasure to be here to talk about this important agenda around levelling up, particularly in the context of our rural communities. And sometimes people say, well, what does levelling up mean? This is something that's been laid at the Prime Minister's door since he first coined the phrase. If you're like me, an MP from Cornwall, it's very obvious what it means. It means money for Cornwall. But besides that, I think we actually all do know what it means. It is about closing the gap between parts of the country that suffer lower wages, lower incomes, fewer opportunities, closing that gap with those more prosperous parts of our country. And we think a key component have various plays on localism over the years, but actually delivering that by giving local communities the tools that they need to help their local economy is going to be important. And we want to do that as well through improving skills and delivering higher wages, so that's a second component. You'll only get those higher wages if you're promoting private enterprise, and so we want opportunities and enterprise and new businesses in these rural areas, and for them to be supported. And then finally, we want to restore pride in place, and for people to be proud of where they come from, where they live, and that to be part of the levelling up agenda. Now, in the rural context, I would just say that I was a Brexiteer, campaigned to leave, but I've always been a believer as well that we shouldn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if there were elements of the previous EU structural funds that we can learn from, well then we should be very much open to doing so. And my personal view is that the so-called leader funds, which was the rural strand of the ERDF fund, actually had some things going for them. And the way they were designed is that they had local-led, community-led development, where they formed these local area groups in a geography that might be county or even part of a county. They'd have local expertise there. And then the criteria for awarding grants was actually quite flexible in terms of the intervention rate that could be used, and flexible in terms of the type of project that could be used. So you had this combination of local-led decision-making about where grants should go to support particular projects, but without so many strings attached that it became stifling, so that flexibility. And I think probably in terms of what we replace those leader funds with in the rural context, we should try to make sure that we retain those bits that worked. But indeed, there were bits of it that didn't work. We used to live in fear of disallowance risk because this or that piece of paper hadn't been filled out the right way with the EU. We can sweep away some of that sort of audit-driven nonsense as well that used to cause problems on the EU schemes. We took a decision quite early on that whereas under the EU schemes, the leader strand of that, the rural strand, was run by DEFRA, we took a view that actually the logical place for it to sit, since it's a wider rural communities fund, was actually through the Shared Prosperity Fund. And because the Shared Prosperity Fund is probably going to work predominantly through local government structures of one form or another. And in my experience, the best way to get local authorities to think about rural communities is to have a pot of money that's got rural written on it, and then they will think and engage rural communities about how best to deploy that. And if you don't have that, the evidence is that they will all go for other more fashionable sectors like digital and so on, and they will sometimes miss the significance and the importance of rural communities. So we are going to make sure that strand will be reflected in the Shared Prosperity Fund, and I'll be working with other colleagues in government to make sure that we get that balance right. And then finally, in terms of the types of things, therefore, that I think we would want to be supporting in rural communities with that future Shared Prosperity Fund, very much around supporting new enterprise. As I go around agricultural shows, which I've not really been able to do for the last couple of years for reasons we all understand, none of us have, but the fascinating thing is the number of people who maybe had a career doing something else, but in their 40s decide to go for a lifestyle change, return to the countryside, to a rural community somewhere, and set up highly successful, highly innovative food businesses. Businesses producing cheeses, jams, gins, all sorts of things. It's really phenomenal as we've seen this consumer trend and interest in food provenance, just how many businesses have sprung up on the back of that. And I think we want to be able to support that. And we also want to be able to support that in the farming context. So one of the things we're seeking to do with our future agriculture policy is have a voluntary exit scheme to help farmers who probably should retire to do so, and to retire with dignity by giving them an additional payment to retire, but also to support new entrants to come into that land so that we have a new generation of farmers, which could be people taking a lifestyle change again in their 40s, or could be younger people who are farm managers or have just left agricultural college, helping them to get that first rung on the ladder and set up their own business. And those are some of the things that I would like to see us doing as part of this levelling up agenda.
George, thank you very much. Caroline.
Thank you for inviting me today. So again, the question of what is levelling up, and levelling up can mean different things to different people. What is levelling up to me? Well, I think we all understand it's about opportunity, about equality, about talent being uniformly distributed, about making sure that everyone gets to showcase those talents, and that levelling up means that those people won't be disadvantaged in doing that by where they live. But to me, it's about more than that. It's about an attitude of removing barriers to success. It's not just telling people how we're going to level up, but it's asking them what they need. So asking rural communities what they need, not townies, as one might say, or those in the cities, assuming that they know what's best for the countryside, which has happened sometimes in the past, and sometimes they get that wrong. So it's instead one that respects rural communities, respects the way of life in the rural areas of our country, and seeks to enhance it in the best way possible. Agriculture is, of course, the backbone of our communities in the rural areas, and the backbone of the rural economy. None of us can live without food. We need to support British agriculture, make it easier for farmers. So Brand Britain, the global Britain, Brand Britain, is a good step forward. Britain's government's agenda for new trade deals, opening up new markets, making it easier for farmers and others to trade in our fantastic, world-recognised high-quality food. This will offer huge opportunities for farmers to increase production and improve the reputation of UK food across the world, which is a good way of levelling up. The green agenda is very important. We hear lots about the green agenda on COP26, which is coming up. Net zero is important. Farmers are part of that solution, and we need to be involved in closing recycling as part of it. We also need to bear in mind that as we're doing this global Britain, as we're making opportunities for farmers, we do so in a way that doesn't outsource environmental damage, in a way that has a level playing field. So in particular, for example, we don't ban neonics in this country and then import things from other countries which have used neonics, because all that's doing is outsourcing our environmental damage to somewhere else. We mustn't penalise those rural communities. For example, when we're thinking about how to decarbonise transport, we need to bear in mind that those rural communities are much more reliant on transport, their own mode of transport, cars, than those in the cities. The opportunities for somewhere like Ancaster, which is a local village to me, to have road, rail, buses, trams and trains and underground trains all coming through the village. Of course, there isn't the population to manage that, so we need to consider the cost of that to the local people and how we ensure that we support, rather than increasing diesel pricing off the road, we actually consider how to support constituencies. The same is true, we've heard a lot about gas prices recently and how we're supporting those who are buying gas off the grid. Lots of my constituents cannot buy gas off the grid because they're not on the grid. So what about the gas that comes in bottles? Are we thinking all the time about the rural community, the rural constituents that we have? Are we supporting diversification? 65% of farmers now, in order to make ends meet essentially, have diversified on their farms. Are we making sure that our planning reforms make it easier to expand businesses rather than difficult? Are we making sure that local farm workers can get the homes that they need? Do businesses have the access to broadband and mobile? The government's got a great project that will share the rural network. And that will increase the amount of the land mass of the UK which is covered by mobile to 95%. We always need to be asking, what about the people who live in the last 5%? Are we making sure no one, because you can't run a rural business if you don't have broadband? And again, the government are working very hard on that. The other thing we need to do is look at public services and access to public services. Many of them are governed by funding formula. But funding formula works on the basis of postcode averages of poverty. And of course, in a rural community, we'll have the large stone rectory next to a little terrace of houses. People are mixed up much more than the cities where you have huge posh housing estates and huge not so posh housing estates. So that the average is not a good way of working out, and it misses out people in the community. In the countryside, and it means that Lincolnshire, for example, has the lowest level of police funding, has very low levels of council funding, and that's in part because the disadvantage is present but hidden. The cost of living is much more expensive. If we give you an example of a little stone farmhouse in Lincolnshire, it may be prettier, more lovely in location, and cheaper to buy than a flat in London. But it's more expensive to travel to the shop, it's more expensive to travel to school, it's more expensive to travel to work, it's more difficult to insulate, and it's much more difficult to heat. We need to recognise that when we're planning services for rural areas. And as a doctor, you'd expect me to mention healthcare. And we need to consider when we're planning healthcare, are we over-centralising into the cities? Are we making it difficult for our constituents to access the countryside, and how we're best making sure they have every opportunity they need? We are fortunate as the Conservative Party represents virtually all of rural England and much of the other rural parts of the UK. I represent personally the most beautiful parts of the United Kingdom in Lincolnshire. And there are others may feel differently on this table. They're absolutely wrong. And as long as every one of our colleagues, policy-wise, considers carefully the needs and wishes of those who represent, then we will truly ensure that we level up for all areas of life in the countryside, not just business, but access to public services as well.
Caroline, thank you. As a Dorset farmer, I might just disagree with that.
Okay, you'd be wrong.
There we go. It's good, always good to disagree. There's a huge amount to unpick there, thank you, in terms of a lot of, I think, sort of policy challenges across the rural economy, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions coming back on everything from sort of healthcare to sort of the gigabit technology, so thank you. Robbie, perhaps I could ask you to say
thank you, Kate. And obviously, Caroline, I'd have to disagree with you representing Keighley,
yes.
Just west of Bradford in West Yorkshire. Dealing with the question that's been asked of us is what does levelling up mean? And of course, it means very, very different things to different people. And for me, it's about rebalancing the economy. There is too much discussion about this pitching the north against the south, and I think that is absolutely the wrong conversation to be having, because the reality of it is, no matter what part of the UK you're residing in, everywhere needs to be levelled up. And when we're talking about the rural economy, my fear is that far too often, when we're talking about levelling up, the rural economy almost is forgotten about. And the great thing that we are able to do now is bring that right to the forefront of our thinking. So how do we go about levelling up the rural economy? And that absolutely deals with the businesses that need to thrive, and giving the businesses the ability to have the freedom to go on and thrive. And of course, I'm a big believer in small government, allowing rural-based businesses, agricultural businesses, the freedom to get on and do what they know best. And of course, one of the big challenges that we have is we are going through the biggest seismic shift in agricultural policy for a generation. We've seen the new Agriculture Act coming out, we've got the Environment Bill working its way through the House, and of course we are entering onto that global platform of generating many new trade relationships. And what we have to absolutely do from a government point of view is provide certainty to businesses, to rural-based businesses, farming businesses. I grew up in rural Lincolnshire where we still farm as a family. But we need to provide those farming-based businesses the ability to have that certainty to go on and thrive. And that means getting a clear direction from government that is about making sure we get our domestic policy right, that aligns with future trade relationships, so that we're able to provide that certainty to businesses and make sure that farming businesses can be profitable within their own right without necessarily having to diversify. And I'm sitting here as a member of Parliament who is from a farming background where we did diversify as a business. We went down the plastic recycling route and started recycling agricultural waste. But that is too common, that we have this over-reliance on farming businesses having to diversify to survive. And I think we almost need to change the thinking behind that, so that when we do have grants coming available, that actually it is about making sure that they use public money wisely to be able to crystallise private inward investment that enables to use that public money wisely. And I'll use some of the examples that I was involved with as a farm business consultant before taking on this role as a Member of Parliament. A vast majority of the grants that we used to have rolled out were all based on capital-based funding, not driven around providing that ability for those that were using the facilities or the assets that it was able to thrive, whether it's cattle handling facilities or the like. It didn't incentivise any skill set or upskilling that went to be able to use those apparatus. And I think that when we are talking about levelling up, we need to make sure that we do not forget that skills-based agenda. And I've been lucky enough to go around many land-based colleges over the last 6 months or so. And I really do think that now is the opportunity that when we are setting out our direction to be able to create a really forward-thinking farming sector that is going to be producing healthy, nutritious food for the future, not only for a domestic market, but to make the most of those export opportunities, that we are really making sure that we utilise our land-based colleges, our further education offering, working alongside businesses to work out actually from a skills perspective, what do we really need over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 plus years to be able to meet that market demand that government policy is going to be hopefully steering us in the right direction of, but also that businesses want to be able to thrive from. And of course, when we're talking about the rural economy, it is not just farming businesses. It is about a change in how the whole nature of businesses and individuals are working. The pandemic, the last 18 months, has made us all appreciate working from home more. And that is exactly why we must make sure that we have proper utilities that rolled out, that enable us all as families, individuals, businesses to make the most of working from home, being able to expand our businesses, being able to expand our input back into that rural economy. And that means getting broadband working right. It means picking up on the utility issues that Caroline mentioned at the moment, when most people within the rural areas maybe don't even have access to being able to have a mains gas supply. And of course, that's before we even start talking about physical connectivity, making sure that an individual that is growing up in rural West Yorkshire where I represent, or rural Lincolnshire where I grew up, has the same opportunities as somebody living here in Manchester in terms of the cost of being able to get to work. You know, most villages only have one bus service or maybe no bus services. So that means that any young person that's growing up in that village is already at a disadvantage in terms of any job opportunities that they're able to utilise. So levelling up, I actually think, is a much bigger challenge when it comes to the rural economy, and something that I'm sure we'll get into the number of debate.
Brilliant. Robbie, thank you. I know that you're a passionate advocate about skills, and that you're working very, very hard to ensure that there is proper investment in skills. So thank you for that. I think it's incredibly important that we do have those skills in the wider rural economy. Thank you. Minette.
Kate, thank you, and I'll try and be brief. And as the representative, effectively, of 55,000 farmers and growers across England and Wales, I can only say that for us, levelling up is about every part of our country being iconic, but very, very different. And I would certainly agree with you, George, that Cornwall always has the loudest voice.
The greatest need.
So it always says. But look, for us, you know, this has very much been, I mean, this is a major reset time. I think it's very easy to think that it is once in a generation, that it is a bit of a tweak. It's phenomenal, and it is to a certain extent the opportunity that we choose to make it. So the NFU has very much been about campaigning. You know, we've been talking about food, less about farming, more about the environment, the need to do them both together. So campaigning for change, but providing sort of full policy documentation for whatever is needed. So please do go and grab one of these off our stand. And it's been an absolute pleasure to work with the team at Onward on levelling up rural Britain and how we bring a united voice. Because I think in the past, and probably what George and I will have felt most on the journey and the opportunity going forward is working better together. You know, building that strength of the British food brand that we've been talking about, building that cooperative power base, so farmers buying more together, selling more together. So the opportunities of levelling up for us are about levelling up for everyone, everywhere. And I won't repeat, because I agree with so much of what has been said, but just to pull out a couple of parts of our thinking, you know, very much building the British food brand, getting back to wherever we can a more localised added value agenda. The microbreweries have been a classic example of added value, of massive opportunity, but we have effectively slightly sold our souls to the big monopolies, to retailers. We've got a huge opportunity with online selling to get back to more of a localised added value agenda, as well as the other bit that I pick up is this opportunity of a new policy. You know, the road to net zero. We are the only country in the world to have legislated to achieve net zero. And agriculture, the very thing that allowed us all to live urban-based lives, it's really alarming when you see someone asleep, but maybe he's not asleep, just got his eyes slightly closed, or perhaps it's just me. So the enormous opportunities that there are with the new policy and getting it right. Climate smart farming to lead the world on antimicrobial resistance, an ambition of David Cameron's. He set out a strategy to lead the world on AMR, and we have done it and should be very, very proud of it and retain that place on the world stage. And carbon neutral food is really, I think, an area that the UK can own and proudly own. The ambition that you've seen by George and others in government to drive higher standards. I think there is a challenge there, which Caroline referred to, on trade deals, making sure that they are fair, that we are importing food produced to the same standards. But the opportunities, and COVID has really shown it. COVID has really shown a country that wants to get back engaged with its diet, that wants to buy raw ingredients, that has also embraced what I would call the green gym. You know, people who are holidaying in this country, who are walking, who don't want to pay a fortune to go and pump weights behind, well, I don't anyway, but that's probably my idleness of not going to a gym. But we've got people out in the countryside like we have never had before. I have never had people on my farm like I have had recently, and that has been absolutely brilliant. And then the other 2 points that I'd pick out as areas that I think we really need to work together on are planning reform, most definitely. When we look to have higher standards, we need bigger buildings. It is as simple as that. And that is really, really important. We can't be a country that says, and we hear this a lot, you know, well, this is my patch, you go and build it somewhere else. You know, we've got 17 million people on a pretty crowded island, so we've got to be pretty accommodating for how this all works going forwards. Future workforce, massive challenge. You'll have heard me and George, no doubt, on every news station talking about the challenges of future workforce. This has really got to change and at pace about how we inspire and empower a UK-focused workforce. That has to happen. And I guess at the heart of all of this, and the big sort of litmus test for government, and having delivered an open letter to our Secretary of State, George Eustace, on self-sufficiency as a metric of success. Now, we talk about once in a generation. I take you back to the last Agricultural Act, 1947. We were 30% self-sufficient. 2 world wars, rationing, starvation in Europe. Do not take food for granted. And we have seen that throughout this past 2-year period. it is dangerous to take food for granted. We're seeing massive, unprecedented challenges at the moment with the price of natural gas. Resilience. So building resilience into an island nation on energy and food security is absolutely key. So this open letter was very much challenging, and I'm sure Secretary of State agrees with me that maintaining self-sufficiency as a metric for success, monitoring it in the food security report that will have to be done this year and every 3 years thereafter, really will test how successful we are. And I don't mean pulling up the drawbridge. A metric of success on self-sufficiency is what we are not consuming here, we should be exporting. So it's not about saying, actually, let's protect this. It's about saying, let's have a new policy that focuses on maintaining, as the number one supplier, our farmers, our growers, but also exporting what we're not consuming. Kate, thank you so much, and I will pause.
Thank you very much. Well, I think all our panellists have thrown up both the challenges that we need to look at, but also the opportunities. I think one of the questions I'd like to ask the panellists is really the sort of around rural proofing, because I think it's quite important that we, as as organisations and farmers, understand that and rural economy understand that rural proofing is permeating throughout all of government. It isn't just sitting, perhaps, George, in your department. I just wondered if you'd like to sort of comment on that.
Yes, I mean, in DEFRA there is a rural proofing team, and there's been a long-standing process for rural proofing of policies right across government. My own experience in all my time as a minister is that any government policy, whether it's a planning policy or a treasury policy or a base policy, whichever department it's coming from, or indeed one of our own policies, you have to go through a process that we call internally right round, and that is basically the formal means by which you try to secure collective agreement from all your ministerial colleagues. And the honest answer, the way that you get rural proofing, in the way that you get is through that collective government process. And so DEFRA will frequently enter reservations or conditions on particular government policies to ensure that rural interests are taken into account. And that's the best way to do it. We've got a team that work on this, but actually invariably it needs sort of ministerial level interventions, whether that's on trade policy or spending policy, whatever it might be. It is through that process of getting collective agreement.
Thank you. I'd love to open it up to the floor for questions, and fantastic. Look, this is great, because we're going to have a very interactive, I think, session, which is fantastic. Perhaps if I can take 2 questions at a time, and I will start on this side of the room first, if I may. So the gentleman at the front and then behind. Thank you.
Was looking for a mic. No worries. So, leveling up was conceived as a policy before the pandemic. And in the last 18 months, I've actually introduced a shift in spending patterns, actually maybe even making the leveling up for the government somehow. My question is, how has this shift changed the perception of the government's mission about the leveling up? And also, is this shift going to stay in terms of safeguarding the working from home and basically all the economic impact on the rural community that these certainly has?
Thank you. And the gentleman behind?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for what he said about the LEADER programme. I sat on the LEADER programme on the Northumberland coast. And the government can give huge pots of money to things like the Borderlands deal that go to big businesses, big projects. And I would say give us that £500,000, we'll give 50 grand to 10 smaller businesses. I think that can give better value for money, so thank you for that. My question is, where I represent on the Northumberland coast, we have a lot of businesses that are ready to level up, they want to expand. We have a huge problem with the price of housing, and it's not gone away with the pandemic, in fact it's got worse. We have a huge staffing crisis because the local people simply can't afford the homes that they want to buy because they've become second homes and holiday lets. It's not a short-term staffing problem that we're seeing in the rest of the country, it's a long-term thing, and I'm sure the member of Cornwall will be well aware of this particular issue. As a council, we can build more council housing, and we're trying to do that. But there are things the government are going to have to do, either on changing the legislation around holiday lets or changing the planning legislation to make it easier to build more houses. So it'd be interesting to know the panel's views on that.
Thank you. So I think, you know, we're looking at sort of policy pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and then obviously, you know, big issue planning. Robbie, perhaps, do you want to kick off with a
Yes.
to both of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just picking up on the second question from Guy, I think the key point that you were making about leadership programs was actually local leadership, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of giving our local, particularly when you're dealing with second homes and the like. And I think that's where planning reform definitely does need to come in, and actually there needs to be a bit more of an open conversation around affordable homes, and actually making sure that affordable homes are affordable to the communities that they represent, and not driven too much by the aperture of market value and how that reflects, but also how you can make sure that certain communities that actually, for topographical reasons or physical challenges, are not able to expand by more housing being created, or whether it's even greenbelt issues, whether there should be more policy that looks at actually protecting homes for local people. And that, I know that's more challenging to enforce for long term, but actually a conversation I think that is definitely worth having. And on the first question, which was about levelling up perception and how the working at home agenda, I think we have to absolutely realise that the pandemic has almost changed how people are working, and we need to ensure that as part of that levelling up agenda for the rural economy, we do not shy away from just that urban focus, which is why broadband absolutely has to be delivered at speed. And when we're having new housing schemes going through, that these are just standard things that are put in as part of a development, as part of planning permission that's being granted, whether it's through the planning consent or through robust Section 106 or community levy and the like, to make sure that we enable local residents to have the choice whether they want to work from home or not.
Thank you. Karen, did you want to add anything on particularly perhaps around the first question?
So I think the first question is really interesting because it does demonstrate both the pluses and the minuses effectively of the COVID pandemic. Because on the one hand, we've seen more people shopping locally. I know if I talk to my local butcher, he's never had such a good year. Talk to the guy that does the groceries, the fruit and veg at the stall in the market. He's never had such a good year because people are they're at home more, and therefore they're shopping more locally, which is great. On the other hand, that we're seeing more people saying, well, I don't need to be in London. Why would I want to live there? I'm going to move out and live somewhere an hour outside of London in Lincolnshire, an hour on the train that is, and therefore the house prices are rising. So that's helping the local shops as there are more people at home working from home, but it's also making it harder for people who work in those shops to buy the house that they need. So it's almost a double-edged sword, which is very interesting to manage. I would agree with much of what Robbie said. We do need to look at how planning works rather than giving top-down quotas. It needs to be more about what local need is and how we can manage the demand for second properties and manage the demand for local people. And I think that's we've seen government working with that, and it's a huge challenge.
Thank you. Should we come back to the floor? Let's go over this side now. So the gentleman here in the third row back, and then at the back as well. So two questions, and then I'll come back to the lady next in a minute. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm Matthew from Grayling Public Affairs. Just sort of wanted to take the Secretary of State up on the right around the process, particularly around the heat and building strategy, which is one of the sort of net zero strategies coming forward, and whether or not what his perspectives are on the rural proofing of that. Because I mean, Dr. Johnson rightly pointed out that many rural communities don't benefit from the gas grid in the sense that the cheap energy supply that brings them, they pay more for their energy, and it looks like the heat and building strategy will move first on rural, so rural homes will have to decarbonise first, potentially 10 years faster than those that are on the gas grid. How in the sense can that truly be levelling up? Because those homeowners are going to face higher costs, higher costs to insulate their home to draft, remote. How is that really going to be sort of a deliverable policy on the basis that the fairness between what rural communities will face as opposed to urban ones?
Okay. Shall I just take the question there, and we'll come back to Secretary of State?
Thank you. Mark Whittington from the beautiful and diverse county of Staffordshire. Just very quickly, I'm also a farmer, which is obviously quite pertinent to what you're talking about today. And it's one reason for George is as we move away from land-based payments, which I don't really agree with, if we're honest about it. It doesn't make you want to produce more, it doesn't make you be more efficient. It's just money you've been hard reforesting as another crop, basically. And we move towards the elms. Now, there's been a lot of talk about it. You talked about it this morning, and I appreciate the complexity of it. But as a working farmer, you'll get zero take-up from farmers because we are running businesses at the end of the day. And the second point, really, which is probably one for the whole table, in terms of that gigabit rollout, it's incredibly important in the rural areas. We've got very little at the moment in certain places. If we want to do autonomous vehicles, if we want to do robot farming, if we want to move forward with drones and all the technology, we do need that 5G rollout. So what sort of commitment have we got from the government on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go to the Secretary of State and then Minette, perhaps I can bring you in after the Secretary of State.
Yeah, on the first one, so the other thing about right round agreements is because they're part of forming collective government policy, they're done privately, and then there's a consensus that comes out at the end. But you are right in the context of rural housing. This is something that we're looking at because it's not going to be enough to meet net zero, just to change building regs for new builds and to make sure that those are carbon neutral. At some stage, we're going to have to find a way of retrofitting or changing the approach on some of those properties that have got gas boilers, or in the case of some rural cottages, might even be on oil-fired systems. And I think there'll be a range of tools. So one that I know in my own constituency is being looked at is hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is a derivative of the sort of AD plants, and actually can be used in place of oil in some of the old sort of oil-fired boilers, and that might actually be a helpful stepping stone that's not carbon neutral but is a step on the way. And you can convert a sort of oil boiler sort of Arga type system for a little more than about £150. And so we need to be looking at all of these options that move everything in the right direction, even though they might be interim options in many cases. But DEFRA will also obviously be playing its part in those discussions. And on the land-based payments, look, I agree. The reason we have to bear in mind that we only have area-based subsidies because of something called decoupling, which was all the rage back at the sort of turn of the century. Everybody was saying this is the way to go, decoupling it from production. To be honest, with hindsight, I think there probably was a better way to do agricultural reform, and you could have introduced environmental conditionality around the payments and changed them in a more coherent way than the EU did in the event, which was just a total decoupling. Because what they did is they removed production subsidies, but they simply created a subsidy for occupying land. And there's a lot of evidence that around 50% of the BPS vanished into inflated land rents. Other bits of it have gone into inflated input costs. And so farmers have been the recipients of the BPS payment, but they've actually not been the only, or probably not even the main, beneficiaries of it. And that's why they still feel they haven't got the money, even though they're getting this check. Now, what we need to do is to unravel that distorting subsidy and actually start to reward the things that we want to reward, which is those environmental outcomes. Now, on the payment rates, we did publish in, I think, the end of June or July, it was a serials event. I published all of the rates for the sustainable farming incentive for next year. Down to the pound, farmers know exactly what they would need to do for different levels of ambition on the various SFI standards that we launched, and exactly how many pounds they will get for that particular intervention. So that's been known for several months. We will also shortly be revising the payment rates on countryside stewardship to bring them into line. And for me, the quid pro quo for getting rid of a nonsensical area-based subsidy is that the replacement schemes shouldn't be based on a sort of income foregone model, which basically says to farmers, if you do a good turn for the environment, the best we're going to do is compensate you. There needs to be an acceptance that there should be a profit margin in that. And we need to have payment rates that incentivise the right level of uptake and become a no-brainer for farmers to go into, not payment rates based on some cost recovery model. And that's what we're moving towards.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Minette.
Well, Mark, I think you've absolutely, sort of nailed the challenge, really. What detail is on the table and what are the payment rates going to look like? And the reason that the NFU, and I have to say with a heavy heart, because George has been and is leading the department at a critical time, exceptionally well in exceptionally difficult conditions. But we have had 40 years under the auspices of the CAP, which went down many different rabbit holes, and here we are today. And here we are today with something that we absolutely have to get right. We have, I think, unprecedented shocks coming towards us on the back of the global pandemic, with input costs spiralling, literally spiralling out of control. Huge focus on CO2. What about fertilizer? Ammonium nitrate is unaffordable. Nobody could afford to do anything with ammonium nitrate right now, and that shows no signs of changing. So the ambition that George has led on fairness in the supply chain absolutely has to happen. Now on dairy, it is happening. On other sectors, it hasn't even started. So why I have called for a pause today is to say, let's sort the supply chain out. Let's sort resilience out, because I do think resilience is one word that is missing from government thinking at the moment. Energy and food supply for 70 million people doesn't just get magicked in by positive thinking. You have to do stuff to really make sure we are resilient going forwards. And we have also legislated to achieve net zero. Now with 60% of the country rural, we need to be able to incentivise farmers. Now some farmers will not be on the bottom rung of the ladder. Some farmers are at the top of the ladder already. So we have to be able to have a scheme that is highly detailed, that rewards farmers, financially rewards farmers for what they are doing. Because that magic word, profitability, we talk so much about sustainability, but sustainability equals profitability in agriculture. We are living with the most unprecedented retail price war due to the rise of the discounters that is driving a coach and horses actually through the whole system. So you've got a situation at the moment where there are really no winners. You see Morrison sold to private equity in the US. Be very, very careful what you wish for, or the rest will go like a pack of cards. This is our critical infrastructure, and we need to treat it like the crown jewels, and it is absolutely at the heart of levelling up in the future. So George has 100% of my support to get the ELM scheme, public monies for public goods, right. But it isn't right yet, there isn't enough detail, and there isn't enough resource for sitting on the sustainable farming incentive platform. So we are asking for a pause. Don't forget, Wales and Scotland are already in that place of 2024. We have to get this right, we have to work together in partnership to make sure that this really stacks up, and that you, Mark, are earning a fair return out of the market and can afford to invest in the environment going forward. Do not treat them separately. They are one and the same. They are symbiotic in their approach.
Thank you. Could I come to the lady who put her hand up here, there? Yes, fantastic. And do we have one other question as well? This lady here would be great. So we'll take you first.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Donnie Gavin. I live in rural Gloucestershire. And a few weeks ago, I met which is a fascinating welding project, one of the oldest welding projects in the UK. And my question to the panel is how you envisage welding projects complementing the rural economy in years to come.
Thank you. Lady here? Yes.
Abby Kay, Farmers Guardian magazine. Question for Deputy Secretary, please. You're talking about a levelling up agenda, but there are a group of pig farmers outside the Midland Hotel who will feel completely disconnected from that right now. They are on their knees. What are you going to do to ensure that the pig sector can continue to keep going?
Thank you. Who wants to take the rewilding with food? Well, I
Sort of feel very needed to take it, but I've been talking, so I don't know that I'm allowed.
Do you want to do
Quickly.
a quick response to that, and Caroline, Robbie as well, and then perhaps Secretary of State can ask the next question. Minette.
Look, I find this a quite infuriating pandemic we have in the UK.
Yeah.
For me, rewilding is not a viable business proposition. As a tenant farmer, my landlord would not allow me to rewild my farm, and I need to get a return out of the market. And I personally have a problem with saying to the public purse right now, if I were that wealthy landowner, pay me to rewild my farm and do lots of good things for the environment. And by the way, I'm not giving you anything on green energy, on food production. I just want to pull down taxpayers' money, and I want to have beavers and all sorts of other lovely things. Well, that would be lovely for some people. That would be lovely. Is that right in this day and age? And when you come with the spending review, George talks about the right round, the huge challenges now that agriculture, the rural economy as a whole will be up against, because we'll be up against the NHS, we'll be up against education, we'll be up against the military, prison services, everybody wanting that money that really doesn't exist. So what I feel we have to do within the NFU is to make a multifaceted, fantastic business plan, which is why we are so involved in levelling up, for doing everything. Yeah, rewilding in some places, but food production, environment, carbon neutral, we've got to do it all. So this debate around, and I've done so many, rewild or not, you've got to do it all, and I don't think the public, why should they just pay for rewilding and indulging people that should be investing in their rewilding projects, which NEP has, in full fairness to them, they've invested. If you want to do it, invest in it yourself. Don't expect the public purse to top it up.
Thank you. Robbie, as a farmer.
I've got one person who agrees.
It absolutely isn't an either or choice. You know, I have to agree with Manette in the entirety, because you know, speaking as someone who's grown up on a farm, still farming family, every element of our farm, there are areas which you are less productive for producing food, which can absolutely go for biodiversity offsetting, for enhancing those in environmental measures. But absolutely, we have to, in my view, be the core of any agricultural business is producing food. And when we are living on an island where we have a finite resource of land, we have to strike the balance right, in my view. And they go hand in hand. It should not be a debate about either or. And my view is that when you are using taxpayers' money to fund environmental benefit, it should be for the provisions of enhancing food production and enhancing that environmental quality for food production. It just shouldn't be just about having land completely set aside for rewilding.
Thank you.
I'm also going to touch on the wilding. I visited NEP in the summer, actually. And I think the important thing people understand is conceptually what we're trying to do as a government is move away from the system we've been in, the Common Agricultural Policy, where it's a top-down rule book, 150 pages of EU rules about what we could and couldn't do, to something that's about supporting the choices that individual farm enterprises make. So we are going to have a scheme that will fund and support landowners that want to follow NEP down that rewilding path. We've said that we're going to pilot another 10 such sites. That won't be for everyone. Indeed, it won't be right for most farmers. But if there are particular landowners on marginal land who decide that that's a journey they want to take, and if that delivers, as the experience of NEP shows, actually some really significant improvements in biodiversity and in nature in a short space of time, you know, what's not to like in terms of supporting those farmers who want to take that course of action. So that's the approach that we take on the wilding issue. On Abby's question, you know, around pigs, look, every sector of the food industry at the moment is suffering labour shortages. Indeed, many sectors of the economy are suffering labour shortages. That's undeniable. In the food sector, most food processors are carrying vacancies of between 12.5% to 15% at the moment. We have brought in a temporary visa scheme under the seasonal workers scheme for poultry in particular. And that is because we know that every year during the month of November you get a 5,500 increase in seasonal labour needs for the turkey sector in particular. So it's justified there. When it comes to other sections of meat processing and other sections of food, there's less of a seasonal pressure. And the truth about the pig situation is it's quite complicated. Some of the processors have had issues accessing the market in China. That they tell me is actually their main problem, and then they are often pointing to labour shortages as being part of the issue. It's clear, and you know, Victoria has met the pig farmers who've come down here today to discuss this earlier. It's clear that another issue is that some of these processors are telling their farmers that they haven't got the labour to do this, but they are then importing large quantities of pork from Eastern Europe, so they actually do have the labour to do the processing. They're just choosing to buy from Eastern Europe rather than from the British farmers with whom they've got contracts. So it's a complex set of issues, some of it market related. The solution, and we are looking at this, rests in the fact that butchers are on the skilled occupation list, and so butchers from any country in the world can actually come to the UK. Some processors have raised issues around the language threshold that's needed, so that's something that I know the Home Office are looking at. But the basic ingredients in our immigration policy are there through the shortage occupation list, through that skilled list, and the ability for people to come in if they're on that skilled list. And we just need to keep refining that to make sure that it works for the food sector too.
Thank you. We have a question, the gentleman standing up, and then the lady who's sitting down behind.
Can I just ask Secretary of State on the same question? The pig farmers, some in the industry are calling for the short-term visas that you've already given out to HGV drivers in the poultry sector. Are you ruling that out?
We've brought in those short-term visas under the seasonal worker scheme, specifically for those sectors in the food industry that have a big spike in demand for labour in the run-up to Christmas. It is a temporary scheme, and it focuses on poultry because we know that there are an additional 5,500 workers who come in to work in the turkey industry during November. And we know that there's a 50% increase in demand in the 2 to 3 weeks leading up to Christmas, and therefore there'll be a need for HGV drivers to drive those food lorries. The challenge on pigs is a different one. It's not about seasonal demand pressures. It is, as I said, much more complicated, some of it market related, some of it due to the fact that British processors are importing pigs from Eastern Europe rather than honouring their contracts with their own British farmers. And the answer, probably, in terms of labour for those sectors, is to use the skilled occupation route in. Butchers are on that skilled list and can come to the UK.
Thank you. The lady at the back.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, it's on a similar question, Emma from the Telegraph. But generally speaking, given the labour shortage issue, what is to stop what is already happening in the pork sector, which is cheaper imports coming in instead of higher wages and using labour supply in the UK, and therefore what impact is that going to have on the farming industry, especially given the pressure they're already under from elms?
Yeah, the reality is that we can, in my view, we can see, and it's very important that we get rising wages for the lowest paid. It's still the case that about 40% of universal credit claimants are working, but they're just not earning enough through their work to pay their household bills. And as a long-term approach, we ought to be seeking to get to the stage where people who work hard and work full-time can actually pay their way without having to rely on benefits of that sort. That's what we've got to be moving towards. And that probably does need some structural changes where we see wages rising for the lowest paid. And actually, there will be, yes, inherent in that, a modest structural increase in food prices. But actually, it's probably not going to be enough to disrupt the fundamentals of our food supply chain. Most retailers seek British food because of its high quality, and they want that provenance. And it's also the case as well that the impact of those rising wages has got quite a modest impact on overall consumer prices in the average basket of shopping goods that a weekly householder would buy.
Minette, could I just ask you very briefly to comment as well? So I'd like to go back to the audience and see if we can get a couple more questions in. So just very
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head as to the massive challenge, and the Secretary of State has very eloquently referred to processors ripping up contracts for British pig producers. And what is going on is yes, you can bring in Danish pork for 30p a kilo cheaper than you can British. So what's not to like? And that is what they are doing. Already bringing in cuts, semi-butchered, and away you go. And this is the real live danger, that if you raise standards here, the market will out. The market will always win. So if you talk about food inflation here, you have to be very careful that what you are producing here is competitive with what is going on elsewhere. Otherwise, if you are uncompetitive in the marketplace, you will be outcompeted. And yeah, there is phenomenal loyalty to buying British, partly, dare I say it, because the NFU has been campaigning, lobbying retail forever and a day to commit to buying British. And most of them, Morrison's, the Co-op, Waitrose, all bar 2 retailers are now 100% on British beef, and many on lamb as well, and that makes a massive, massive difference. But going forwards, you know, they will buy on price, and that is what we are seeing in the pig sector at the moment. So once you start talking about wage inflation, you know, we are seeing what I've said about input costs, we are seeing absolutely exponential rises in energy, in all input costs. And when you see food inflation, the market then takes over. And the rise of Aldi and Lidl, don't forget, they are the discounters. They are the discounters, so they drive the pricing of everybody to create footfall, and that is why we have lived with a retail price war that we are still living with, and it isn't going away. Previously, it used to last for a few months, then it would be over. We are living with it. We are living with a cutthroat food system in this country, and it does require, I'm afraid, when you get market failure, that is what governments do. They intervene in a market failure situation.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question at the back, the gentleman at the back?
It's a bit of a big picture question, but is a low tax, low subsidy rural economy possible?
Well, that's a very good yes or no question.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So
Give me an
I'm
explanation
going
as to
to
why.
go along our panel, starting with Caroline.
Yes.
Secretary of State.
Yes.
You can't have your cake and eat it.
Well, I would say absolutely yes. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. I think there's been fantastic discussion in the room, so thank you everybody. I really appreciate all the incredibly good questions. I think as panels we might disagree on the beauty of our various places, but I think we can all agree that everybody here is completely passionate about the rural economy, about levelling up, about ensuring opportunities and finding solutions. So I really want to thank Caroline and George and Minette and Robbie for a really interesting discussion, and particularly thank you to all of you. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.